Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Spring 2023 briefing on protecting UH research. My name is Sandra Ferruto, and I'm the Director of Data Governance at the UH system. This morning's session will be recorded, and also the session recording and slide deck will be made available on the Office of Research Compliance site shortly after today. With me this morning is Jody Ito, Chief Information Security Officer at UH, Victoria Rivera, Director of Office of Research Compliance in the Vice President for Research and Innovations Office. And we also have a special guest who we're very excited to have here. His name is Tony Lang, and I will introduce him in a moment. For our agenda today, we're going to be starting off with Tony and then moving on to Jody, who will talk about vulnerabilities and compliance. I will cover a bit about data governance, and then Victoria will wrap up with disclosure requirements and conflict of interest. So let me go ahead and introduce our special guest, Tony Lang. He is the Chief Division Counsel and Supervisory Special Agent for the FBI's Honolulu Division. Tony has spent over 26 years with the FBI in several different legal and operational roles, including counsel in Honolulu, Washington, D.C., and Seattle. Prior to joining the FBI, Tony worked for the U.S. Department of Justice, Office of U.S. Trustees, and clerked for the Honorable William J. Lederer of the Pennsylvania Commonwealth Court of Appeals. Tony is a native of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and holds degrees from the Johns Hopkins University and the University of Chicago. He is a member of both the Pennsylvania and District of Columbia bars. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Tony.
Great. Thanks so much, Sandra, for the warm introductions. And thank you, Jody Ito and Melvin, sitting in the room here for hosting me. It's just such an honor to be here. I feel like the FBI has always had a symbiotic relationship with the University of Hawaii for many, many decades. And I know Carrie Okinaga, the Vice President General Counsel, has been very kind to the FBI. We've worked with her on many various issues, as well as your security office with Andy Black and Carol Lee, both FBI, former FBI agents retired and came here to the University of Hawaii to help out. So always grateful for them, working with them on various issues. So just one caveat or warning is, as Jody and Sandra mentioned, I am a legal counsel. I don't have a lot of background in IT or tech, but what I have done is, and I always ask our tech people within the FBI Honolulu divisions to really kind of dumb it down for me, because I'm always looking more at the legal issues when it comes to basically we have some kind of not disaster, but some kind of leak or breach of our systems. And I'm always trying to see from a legal perspective, how can we preserve that evidence for possible discovery issues or depositions down the line. So I kind of see it at that angle. But with that said, I am exposed to different areas when it comes to research. And we work closely with not just our private sectors, but other universities. And I feel, being in Washington, D.C. and Seattle, I work closely with the University of Washington on issues dealing with research, as well as some of the major universities in the D.C. area and Virginia and Maryland on issues as well. And I always have an affinity for academia and education. I'm very fortunate. I've been able to teach some classes at Johns Hopkins University over the past couple of years, more on international terrorism, domestic terrorism. And this is completely self-serving, but we're teeing up a class this fall with the University of Hawaii Richardson Law School on domestic terrorism and hate groups in America and the rise in that. So it's great to work with University of Hawaii on that. And it's going to be a very, really late class. So I'm hoping we get at least 1 or 2 students register. But for my commute from Kapolei to Manoa, I have to have it later in case of traffic, whether I can make it or not. So, but for this presentation, I'm going to talk more about some of the big cases that we've seen in the past couple of years and really four major areas where we've seen universities specifically have vulnerabilities. And then what we can do at the end, again, teaming up with Jody and Sandra to really help assist you all in not just breaks or breaches, but even being more proactive when it comes to people targeting universities. And it's in the news. Many different universities and research think tanks have been targeted by not just hackers, but foreign actors as well. And to some extent, I can't talk about all specific cases, but I will try to talk about ones that have already been out there in the media or have been fully adjudicated. So this is supposed to be a chuckle slide, but you can see for the FBI, when for us to advance, we have to go to Washington, D.C. at some point. And I've been unfortunate in my career to have 3 tours back at our Hoover building in Washington, D.C. You can see what it really does to you physically and as well as mentally. But if you look on the left, my Hawaii picture, you can see very happy, nice to be there. I have my Tory Richards Hawaii shirt on. On my right, another thing blew up in Washington, D.C. I'm trying to do damage control, and you can see how I aged over the many, many years. So I'm very fortunate that I was been able to come back here in Hawaii. This is my 2nd tour. So this is my, in total, 13th year in Honolulu with the FBI as the chief counsel. And this will probably be my last tour. If they try to bring me back to DC, I'll probably quit and try to do something else. So anyway, with that said, it's great to be in Hawaii, and thank you all for accommodating me. The one thing I want to throw off right at bat, and before in preparing for this webinar, I reached out to some of my strong cyber agent friends all across the country, saying if you had to give one advice or tip for university researchers and IT people at University of Hawaii, what would it be? And they all unanimously came up to this new project we're doing with the FBI. It's called the Griffin Citadel, and it's actually based out of our cyber division, but we're reaching out to all the universities and as well as private companies. And it's a free service that we can do. It's kind of a cursory service where we actually can check all the open web pages and open internet sites that say University of Hawaii has, and we can kind of scour it. We don't go into the content because that may be protected, proprietary, but we're just trying to see if there are people around the world who are maybe attacking or really just kind of too close to your systems. And we can do that through this complex, and it went right above me, but there's many different layers. And what we're looking at specifically are the logon sites to your websites. And we can, and these are some of the sites that we do look at. For us, the FBI, we use Microsoft 365, but other companies or universities may use some of these log type page overviews, and we can actually scour that. It's called, the term we use is talon eye and talon front, kind of like a claw. We kind of scrape the surface, but we can kind of tell if there are hostile actors, maybe really pinging your websites or your systems. And then what we do is when we gather all that data, we send it back to Jody or Sandra and say, we think these actors, based on our databases, have done this with other companies or universities. And then we can compare that. Then it's like a threat assessment, basically saying, we think these people may be trying to infiltrate your systems or your research technology. So that's something that's out there. We're always willing to help. If you want to know more about Griffin Citadel, please feel to call me or FBI office, and we'll put you in touch with our cyber experts, not just here in Honolulu, but as well as in Washington, D.C. to do that. So again, this is nothing new to you. We do compile data because we're always curious, the FBI, on what's targeted most. And believe it or not, it's changed a little bit over the past 10 or 15 years, but the top 5 organizations have always remained the same. And these are the industries that are most vulnerable to cyber attacks in 2022. That's based on our data. But obviously financial services, that's where the money is. So all the banks in New York, LA, DC, they're obviously the #1 targeted because a lot of the scammers, the fraudsters want to get money. Healthcare as well, that's really, really big. And we were just talking with Sandra about HIPAA and protected information, but it's a great way that we see fraudsters assuming identities of people And you know, a lot of people in the healthcare industry, there are financial links to those healthcare information. So we're seeing that targeted. And probably more important for this webinar, number 3 is education. With all the research going on in like University of Hawaii, a major research institution, we're seeing these targeted very, very much. So that's why we work closely with Jody and Sandra to see what we can be more proactive in that. We're seeing more energy and utilities, the power grids. Again, a great way. We're seeing a lot of these, even in the international terrorism arena, we saw possible terrorist attackers targeting that, because if you do knock down a power grid, electricity, look what it does to the society and the message it sends. So that's a big one. And number 5, government agencies. That would be law enforcement, Department of Defense, Department of Energy, where, you know, we do research and, you know, involved with sensitive information, even classified up to top secret SCI. So these are the top 5 areas we've seen really a cyber attacker is targeting. I just wanted to mention one brief one. It's not a university, but this happened fairly recently in the Los Angeles School District. I'm sure many of you heard about last year. But if you just look at the targets, and this is out there in the public arena, we determined it was a Russian group. And again, for us, in terms of legal jurisdiction, when a lot of our targets are overseas and, you know, we don't have a mutual legal assistance treaty with them, it's very hard to identify them. And if we do identify them, to actually extradite them back to the US with no treaty. So basically we're kind of out of luck. But this was a Russian hacking group called Vice Society. But look at some of the data they took, up to 500 GB, but in terms of social security numbers, tax forms, passport, other legal documents, health information. And then even this kind of hits close to home. You know, some students may have had conviction reports. They might have been involved in juvenile court, and even the mental health and psychological assessments. All that was taken by this Russian group. And think about how they could then use that to blackmail people, even individuals as well, and then get looking ultimately that goal to get more money. So this is just an example. Very, very important to really protect your information. So I mentioned earlier the top 4 areas that we really look at for the FBI that we found that are really vulnerable. And one, of course, is PII, which is personally identifiable information, then PHI, protected health information. And this is just some areas we see, not particular University of Hawaii. I just have that logo there. Hope I didn't have a copyright violation. I could use the general use under exception, since that logo is out there in the public arena. But yeah, what we've seen a lot of the hackers attack is financial data of not just students, but obviously faculty, even applicants who apply to the University of Hawaii and other universities. Staff and even alumni are vulnerable to these breaches. We've seen a lot even in season ticket holders and theater ticket holders, where you have to put in your financial information, maybe a credit card, and that might not be as protected as like a student database or a faculty database. And we've seen hackers get into that very easily. Even campus parking permits. A lot of times you have to put your DMV, things of that nature in there, even your vehicle data. You have an Acura or a Volkswagen. That's something that hackers can use as to exploit you and to actually make you feel, well, if they know I have an Acura, it must be a University of Hawaii a person asking for this information. So very, very clever, these fraudsters. And then, of course, University of Hawaii, we have the Johns Burns Medical School, and I'm sure there's medical and financial data on possible patients or research projects. So that's something we've seen attacked often, or medical schools. So here's an actual case study we had involving PII, where we found out information that university had foreign attackers attacking 2 of their big servers. And these servers were really, these attackers were very clever, that they used kind of pivot points, masking that to get into the university system. And we worked with the university to do kind of computer forensic analysis, and to see where the attack was. Again, these were foreign actors, so we couldn't really go after them, and it wasn't a friendly country. So we could, if it was a friendly country, we'll work with the host government to see what we can do, either prosecute him there in the foreign country or bring him, like I said, extradite him back here. Here, this was a country that we couldn't, Russia. So we worked with the university, Jody and Sandra's shop, say University of Hawaii, to come up with some kind of infrastructure so they could spot when these foreign attackers happened. Luckily, in this case, these were actually foreign dissidents who actually studied at the university there. So they had some inside track on the university and how the computer systems work, but luckily they weren't able to exfiltrate and take any of the information with them because we were able to catch this fairly quickly before any damage was done. We don't mention the university because we want to protect the identity. So that's PII, where we see a lot of that happening with attackers. Another big one is intellectual property. And the University of Hawaii has a great research program when it comes to engineering and the hard sciences as well. And I know I was just talking with Sandra, Jody, and Melvin. I know offsite UH does engage with DOD on even possible classified contracts. And we've seen a lot of attacks on DOD facilities. Even here in Hawaii, I can tell you it happens often, foreign attackers. And when we scour that, we do see at times contracts with the university. And we just want to make you aware of that even if you're contracting with DOD, just be aware that because of your affiliation with DOD or the contract you sign, that there's a way that these hackers can go through DOD to get the University of Hawaii systems. And so we see a lot of that with the universities. So here's another case that we were involved in Southern California with a spear phishing, which you all know happens through an email. And the professor is very famous in the Southern Cal area. And then we found about this spear phishing from the university, but it was on his cell phone, and we felt that his cell phone and his email was compromised. So we worked closely with the university and this chief security officer. And we discovered as we were going through the systems that large email attachments from these spear phishing fraudsters weren't being scanned by the university. And it was probably due not to, they had the technology, but maybe it was more some of the people within that group weren't doing due diligence to do that. And that happens a lot. So we again assisted with the forensic analysis, and we told them that, with these, they should be a scanning system. So they'll catch these kind of spear phishing emails and making sure that it automatically has some kind of suspicious bucket where the university and the students, in fact, can throw it to the suspicious bucket and do not open it. And so that we kind of created that program with that university, which was very, very helpful. That's something that we also implemented here with the FBI with that. Okay, the number 3 area is bandwidth. And again, here we're looking at kind of data pipes or hot points where we've seen China, the PRC, are very good at that, where they can actually mask where they are. And they also, so you actually feel they're part of the university, but they're actually not. And they'll use a website or an email address, which you think, okay, it's affiliated with the university, but it's actually not. And then when you respond or send information, it goes to another hot point where they're actually the ones controlling that website. And so we've worked a lot with universities on that. Just be aware, there'll be some kind of glitch in that website, which just doesn't make sense. I mean, it could be spelling errors, grammatical errors, something to that effect. If you see that, think to yourself, maybe this is not a legitimate part. And if you're not sure, please reach out to Jody or Sandra or Melvin about that before you send information or release information in that area. So again, I talked about China and again, Russia. I think it's well known that a lot of the hackers are from those 2 countries. But here we identified Russian cyber hackers. They were proxying through university networks, and they were able to make the traffics appear legitimate, although it was really going back to Moscow. So what we did, we were able to install wiretaps at some of these universities with the consent of the universities to see how this traffic was moving through. And what was interesting, we found out that these Moscow taggers were not using sophisticated technology. It was very basic, off-the-shelf stuff you could buy at Best Buy, or Circuit City's out of business, right? Okay, I guess I'm dating myself. Not Circuit City, Best Buy, right? That's still here, but off-the-shelf type of software, and they were using that very rudimentary, but it was successful. It was working very well, where they were able to mask it and send it to that area. So again, just be cautious of these websites that they're posing as an official company, as an official server. Okay. The last one I want to talk about is IT infrastructure, and we're seeing a lot of these not just fraudsters but criminals. And when I mean IT infrastructure, they're using that as part of the criminal element and basically for criminal purposes. And we're seeing a lot of security networks running. When I say innocent images, that's child pornography issues where they'll be sending images, things of that nature. You're not sure, you click on it, all of a sudden you opened it up, and again, there's a virus or something to that effect. But we're seeing more IT infrastructure being hit by the criminal activity folks, and we're seeing this done in farms, botnets, and DDoS attacks as well. And one great example we see a lot is innocent images, and we see a lot of these people who sell these child pornography images or distribute them actually go onto a university campus, and somehow they get access to the Wi-Fi there, and they'll use that to actually email, sell these child pornography images. And it's hard for us because if we find out about it, we can do a check, and we find out it's coming, say, back to University of Hawaii's Wi-Fi, but we know it's not a student or a faculty member in 99% of the cases. Sometimes it is, and we've had cases against university personnel, faculty on child pornography. Just to make the caveat clear, child pornography is a federal violation. If it's just regular pornography, that is not. But I know each university has their own internal policies on accessing that kind of material on university servers. But for us, we're looking more at the child pornography issues. So we see that a lot with universities, where these folks are very sophisticated in doing that. So besides innocent images, we're also seeing that with credit card hacking as well, where they will go on universities' Wi-Fi and use that to do their criminal activities. And it's harder for us to kind of track that if it comes back to a university. Then we'll work with Jody and Sandra's shop and come up with legal processes, whatever they would need, a subpoena or a court order to access that information. But again, that takes time. And by that time, the hacker has moved on to a different farm to do his criminal activity. And so my last slide, I think this is my last slide for final thoughts. Again, we have a great partnership with University of Hawaii already. And I spelled enforcement wrong. Sorry about that. But one thing we do notice, and we encourage the university to come out is make it public that you are partnering with the FBI. We've noticed that acts as a deterrence to some of the hackers, knowing that the university is working closely with the FBI to monitor these types of systems. And at the same time, for us, we're seeing a lot of these national security implications where we see these foreign actors attacking, especially classified systems. That's a big concern to us. If it does affect our national security, and that could be, our warfare systems, how we position people around the country, that all has national security implications. So we're very concerned about that, as well as the criminal activity as well. Luckily, we also have very good contacts within the FBI Honolulu with the University of Hawaii, with Jody, Sandra, and I know we met Victoria, and she has one of our contacts, Shannon Hickman, in our FBI Honolulu office. So, we have, I know, InfraGard as well to help with the system. So please please reach out to us through Jody or Sandra, and we're more than happy to help and assess. And then if something did happen where there's a breach, we're here to help. One thing from the legal hat is, once we collect information from the University of Hawaii, we have the Privacy Act as well. So we definitely safeguard your information. It's very confidential. We don't share it with outside people. And then if we are able to find out who the bad person is, and if we can go after them, we will. We'll protect the information as close as possible. If it does go to trial, we have protocols, or we can do ex parte in-camera motions with the judge to protect the information, especially if it's classified as well. So it's not out there in open court, because I know how much you all value and safeguard your research. So we do that. We don't just throw it out there and do press releases or anything like that. So I think that's kind of where I am. So I'll turn it back to Sandra. Oh, okay.
Out here too. Thank you. Thank you, Tony. That was very informative. And we did allot some time for questions. So if you do have any questions, please include them in the Q&A, and we'll hang on for a few minutes. Do we have any? No? Thanks. Okay, well, I think we're good. Thanks,
Thank
Tony.
you. Thank you, Sandra.
Okay. We do have one? Okay, two. Okay, hang on here. Okay. Okay, so, okay, Amy is asking, how do I find out who hacked my Yahoo email? I think, I think Jody will answer you on that one. Okay, Jimmy is asking, he said, no question, great presentation. Mahalo to our host and presenter for putting this on. Thank you for your kind words. Let's see. Mary is asking, with phishing and similar threats, is there ever a threat just from opening an email? Or is the threat always from clicking on links, opening attachments, etc.? Jody, do you want to take this one? Yeah, why don't you come here, since you're up next. Sure.
All right, so thank you very much, Mary. So with phishing and similar threats, is there ever a threat from just opening an email? It's possible. However, it's less likely, right? So I'm looking at Melvin, but really there are some ways that people can embed malware, and it might be like something you can't even see, but it's attached to the email. But more than likely, it will be in the form of a malicious link that is included, or a malware infected attachment. So as Tony was talking about earlier, it's very important to ensure that attachments that you receive by email, you scan them first with antivirus software to make sure that it does not contain malware. I will be talking about something a little bit more later on as one of our UH initiatives that we hope will help with either the malicious links or the malware infected attachment. So more on that later. Sorry, there's more questions, Melvin. So from Giuseppe, I understand there are many resources to protect us in the US from bad actors from the outside, but how about cases in which a faculty travels to a foreign country? Are there risks that someone could hack into our computers without our knowledge? And are there ways to protect ourselves? You want to take a shot at that?
Yeah, no, thanks. That's a great question. And yeah, anytime you go overseas, of course, depending on what country you go to, but we've had situations where even FBI employees have gone overseas and they've been targeted, meaning in their hotel room or even going to conferences, their cell phones. So it's almost, we're kind of assuming they'll be compromised depending on the country. I mean, particularly China or Russia. So as a protection, and I don't know if UH, when you travel with, say, a laptop Do you have like a protected server or anything like? Yeah, so just basically be careful of your thumb drives. I wouldn't leave them out there. Make sure you take your we always tell people, take your laptop, cell phone with you. Don't leave them in the hotel rooms with you, because where other people could get access to keep it with you and safeguard it. But I think you're actually more vulnerable overseas. And then, yeah, once damage done, it's kind of hard to correct that. So, yeah.
Okay. So my question is, are there some countries that we need to be more concerned about when we travel there? And how would we find out where these countries are, which countries those are?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, absolutely. And like Jody said, State Department does issue warnings where some countries they're just a greater national security threat, and even a criminal threat. I just know from my experience, we've seen a lot of compromises in like Southeast Asian countries, not Japan, but even over in some of the Middle East countries and even the former Russian republics, we've seen some compromises there as well. So it really depends where you go. But yeah, I would just safeguard all the equipment with you, and even as you're emailing using different servers and all, just be aware that they could be compromised, and people could be looking at your traffic. And just because each country has different laws, and some are more government focused, where they're allowed to, without getting a court order, like here in the US, to not just see where you're emailing people, but also content as well.
Thank you. Let's see. There's a few more questions here. If someone suspects their device has been compromised, is there a place to bring the device to do an analysis? You want to answer from FBI and let me know?
Yeah, no, if you feel that your device has been compromised, yeah, you can reach out to us. We would look at an assessment to see. I'm working with Jody's shop to see if there was criminal or national security implications as well. Our resources are kind of limited, so it's not like we could look at 100 laptops right away. But if we feel this will have an impact, if Jody and Sandra feel that there could be federal violations here, we would be happy to take a look at it.
And from the university's perspective, we would probably, especially if it's a personally owned device, really it depends on how you're using it. And if you were using it for university purposes, and if you have sensitive information on it that belongs to the university, please reach out to infosec@hawaii.edu. But if it's just your personally owned device and you're suspicious, then I would suggest you try to reach out to some of the local computer services that could help you. Melvin sitting here, do you have any other suggestions? No? And find your best tech friend. So, but really it's about ensuring that you put the protections on your devices ahead of time so they don't become infected. So antivirus definitely, and also just watch for some suspicious activities. Like if you feel like your laptop is getting warm and you're not really doing anything on it, same thing with your cell phone. Basically look for not normal behaviors, and then we can try to assist with pointing you in the right direction as to where you need to go. And I know there's a couple more, Jimmy, and we're getting the time signal. So Jimmy's asking for overseas travel. Do you recommend not using your own personal cell phone to purchase a local burner phone? I don't necessarily have a, Tony?
Yeah, no, yeah, that's one option. I've seen people do that. But again, I think like Jody said, if you have the security measures on your personal cell phone, that should be fine.
Thank you. Okay, there's a bunch more questions, but I think what we're going to do is we'll answer the questions, but we'll type it in, and then Tony will assist with that. So, and then we're going to move on because I think we've got a time. So I'm just going to roll my chair over. Sorry, we're physically rolling around here. All right. So I'm not sure of this new setup. So I'm going to talk about the vulnerabilities in compliance, and I'm Jody Ito, Chief Information Security Officer for the University of Hawaii. So basically what I want to start with is just kind of going over some of the things that we talked about during the last research webinar, is just so that you're aware of the things that Tony was talking about, how foreign adversaries might be looking at infiltrating, meaning breaking into our UH environment to try to steal things. And this slide basically talks about how the defense industrial base is being targeted. So these are contractors that are doing work on Department of Defense or military contracts, of which we have those types of grants and awards here at the University of Hawaii. So for those of you that have those types of contracts, please be sure that you're aware of what's going on. This is just a little bit more detail about the type of activity that we find has occurred here at the University of Hawaii. So I'm not sure if you remember, but in 2017, we actually had an advanced persistent threat, hostile nation state, infiltrate our UH network to try to grab some research information. So you might think it doesn't happen here. Yes, it does happen here. And this is just a slide. So if you look at the link at the very top of the slide, it's from basically the Department of Homeland Security, Cybersecurity Information Security Agency, CISA. I might have gotten the acronyms wrong. Okay. So this is basically a list of the types of alerts that they put out. So really what you should be doing is kind of tracking this so that you can be alerted for when vulnerabilities are discovered for the devices, the servers, the software that you are running. Now, very specifically, I'm bringing this one up, and this was recent in the sense that we actually saw an attacker trying to use this vulnerability in Fortinet SSL VPN services. So again, you think it cannot happen here. It is happening here. And this is the reason why you need to patch your devices. In this case, you needed to patch the firewall quickly. So if you look at this, we call this the CVE, the critical vulnerability database. So the base score is 9.8 critical. That means it is at the nearly the top of the list of a vulnerability that you need to patch immediately, right? So the highest score is 10, and that's the worst possible scenario. And that means drop everything, patch now. So again, pay attention to these sorts of vulnerability lists and make sure that the devices, servers, and software that you're running is patched to be up to date so that the attackers cannot take advantage of it, cannot exploit it. So the other thing that's coming up is, you know, maybe many of you have heard about this thing called ChatGPT. And this is basically an artificial intelligence program, and it uses something called large language models. And it's kind of cool because it's sort of like you ask it a question or you tell it something and it will give you a response that is actually really decent. But, you know, as it is being used for good, our adversaries are using it for bad things. And in this particular in this particular example, they're using it to try to look for vulnerabilities and then reporting it to the company where they're finding the vulnerability. So that's called bug bounties, pen testing. And so that's kind of a good use of it. However, that also means the adversaries and attackers can use it for the same purpose, but for malicious purposes. So again, this is more for you to be aware of how these types of tools can be used. So very specifically, this is one that we did in the information security team, where we're saying you're an HR representative with the University of Hawaii named Alice V. Write an email in English with some local Hawaiian influences to Bob, asking them to verify changes to the tax record, and then request that they review the attached documents, right? So that's already telling them that you want to click on a malware infected attachment, and the language should be somewhat casual. So here's what ChatGPT returned. So as you're reading this, if your name was Bob and your HR rep was Alice V, would you open it? Would you click on the attachment that was that came with the email? I read this and I go, yeah, maybe. But basically, I would actually suggest if somebody is reaching out to you to verify information about your tax records, make sure you pick up the phone, right? You never want to click on an attachment because, again, the attackers are becoming very good at crafting what appears to be a legitimate email. And this is what these kinds of artificial intelligence things can be used for. Okay. And the other way that, some of this large language models can be used is to write research papers or write term papers. And so how do you actually verify if the information is written by a human or and not by one of these artificial intelligence things? So again, I don't have an answer for it, and it's just something that you need to be aware of. And so the other side of this is that people are trying to recognize when plagiarism is being drafted by these artificial intelligence agents. So I haven't tried it yet, but it's something that I was searching for, I came up with. So, if you have time, you might want to experiment with some of these, as they can be used for good. Remember that they can also be used for bad. Okay. So specifically, I wanted to get to some of the UH incidents and initiatives. So number one, whenever you're plugging in a device to the University of Hawaii network, make sure you understand that it's going to be public to the entire internet, unless you are sitting behind a firewall. And you would need to work with your unit IT folks, your campus IT folks, to determine if you are on the private network or if you're going to be on the public general internet. So in general, the University of Hawaii network is very open with these public IPs addresses that you're generally assigned. It means that any attacker can be scanning the university network at any given time to look for vulnerable devices. Okay, so one of the devices that we actually discovered was called a smart display called OneScreen, and it was vulnerable out of the box by default. And what had happened was that the manufacturer had an open port on it that allowed whoever connecting to that open port to gain root access. Totally bad. I mean, that is horrible, I guess, practices of the company itself. And what happened when that happened is the attackers then came in and they were able to install software and use that malicious software on that TV screen, basically, and were able to use it to attack other networks. Okay, so these are the kinds of things that we actually found happening on the university network. And we find that a lot of people are buying these OneScreen smart displays and putting them in classrooms. So, there's a lot of things that need to be done to be able to protect these types of devices. And the other thing we're still finding is people are plugging in their multi-factor devices, which are generally printers and scanners, to the network. And then they're scanning sensitive documents on it and then storing that sensitive documents on the hard drive that lives on that device. But because, again, that printer or multi-function device is on the public UH network, it also allows anybody on the global internet to look for information that should be protected. So we actually ran and scanned for open printers and open multi-function devices. And we actually found that there were things like employment documents scanned on it, that there were health cards scanned on it. And so we reached out to them to make sure that that's removed and that practice is stopped. And also make sure that the administrative passwords that come default on these devices, you change it immediately. because the default passwords are known by everybody globally. And that's the first thing that the attacker is going to try. And then also, please make sure that the device is using HTTPS to make sure that the transmission, the traffic to and from that device is encrypted. So this is some of the initiatives that we're currently doing, and specifically around the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, GLBA. It will now require that multi-factor authentication be used to access information services here at the University of Hawaii that has student financial aid information. But because student financial aid information, we don't exactly know exactly where it resides, we are going to mandate that everybody in the University of Hawaii system use multi-factor authentication. So we already have it available to you. Duo is what you may be familiar with, but it's not mandatory. But it will be by the end of the year. So you can expect to see more information from ITS as to how this will be implemented. And this also includes students. So students will have to use MFA to access their information in STAR and any other of the institutional information systems that we manage and maintain. So that's a heads up for you. And the other thing that we're going to be implementing is a product called Proofpoint. And we call this an email gateway to mitigate some of the things that Tony was talking about, malicious links in email or malware infected attachments. And it is pretty sophisticated. There is embedded in it machine learning, automated AI, artificial intelligence, and it also pulls from globally the types of threats that Proofpoint is seeing. And so we hope this will also help with some of the "are you available" types of phishing emails that we get, during the semester, targeting our leaders and also people who work for our leaders, right? Trying to get them to buy gift cards in response to request, an urgent request from your supervisor or your department chair or your dean or director. We are currently learning more about it, and we will provide more information about this Proofpoint implementation as we get closer to rolling it out. So be expecting webinars specifically on that. And lastly, again, because of all of the attacks on research, our federal government is understanding that research also needs to be protected, which means they're going to implement regulations to help us protect it. So we've talked about the cybersecurity maturity model certification early on. And basically that is pushed back a little. We had expected that it might be released as an interim rule in March. However, it's not going to be. The DoD, Department of Defense, is still reviewing it, and there will be a 60-day public comment period when they're getting ready to start rolling it out. But the other thing is the DoD will need to respond to every comment that's received. So my guesstimate is that maybe we'll see the rule actually finalized in 2024, but it may roll out as an interim rule later this year. The DoD has signaled that it will be a slow rollout, meaning that requirement will not be inserted into every DoD contract just yet. But for those of you that are currently working with DoD projects, stay on top of this. So those two links at the bottom of the slide will give you more information about CMMC. And that second link is something new. I just learned about it the other day. It's called Project Spectrum. And it has some of the services is where you can ask that Project Spectrum to provide you with some general assessment information. So I personally haven't tried it, but it might be something that you want to keep an eye out on. The other one that we talked about previously is the NSPM 33, the National Security Presidential Memorandum 33, which talks about the national security strategy for government-supported research and development. So the entire document is available at that link. And again, this will have specific requirements, including setting up a research security program. So those of you that are doing research, you will need to understand what this means. So we will have, again, more information specifically about this. And I believe Victoria will be talking a little bit about disclosures related to this. So again, government recommendations and requirements are things that we actually need to be paying attention to. And just again, this is where we are looking for standardized disclosures and conflicts of interest. And these are going to be required for projects. And as you see at the bottom, the National Science Foundation has been assigned the lead for this. So before, the NSF was not very active in terms of having regulations for research, but that is changing. The whole climate is changing related to that. We used to talk about the NDAA 889, which talks about not being able to use any of the banned technologies. So this newest signal from the FCC is actually banning the sales and imports of China tech from Huawei and ZTE. So it is actually expanding it. Before, the NDAA was mostly around defense types of projects, but with the FCC, that is triggering a much larger scope. So for those of you here at the University of Hawaii that are running Hikvision camera systems or using equipment from Huawei or ZTE, get rid of it now. We actually have found instances of where it is being used, understanding that there will be a time period that you need to be able to transition it out, but just don't buy any new ones, okay? And then put it on your radar that you rotate that out as soon as possible. And then just this, and this is from our friends at the Department of Justice, there are actually invoking their civil cyber fraud initiative, where they are actually fining people for violating this. So these are things that you do need to pay attention to. And this is basically where you're misrepresenting information to the government. Like you say you're actually secured and abiding by these regulations, and it turns out you're not. So that's talking about it in very high level terms, but keep an eye on this also. You don't want this to be the University of Hawaii, okay? There are links to these reports, so please go ahead and take a look at it. And then lastly, this whole last set of slides will be talking about how the National Science Foundation is addressing security for research. Again, links to more information, so please go through and read this. And again, National Science Foundation really found that there was foreign interference in some of the research processes. So this is again why research is under the gun, and they're squarely in the crosshairs of our government agencies to be able to secure our processes. And there is administrative actions being taken against some of these people who are in violation of these things. So again, mostly for your background and information, but to know that this stuff is happening. So we don't want this to be us. And there is an actual report about how the People's Republic of China recruited scientists from Los Alamos National Lab, right? So again, they go on these recruitment campaigns and you could be targeted, right? So you need to be aware of these efforts so that you can recognize them and prevent yourself from being a victim, okay? The other good news is the National Science Foundation is actually addressing this by sponsoring grants to produce training. So these are the 4 areas that they will be focusing on: the importance of research security, importance of disclosures, risk management mitigation, and about international collaboration. So these were just issued last year. So I believe they will be looking for results and actual products by the end of this year. And again, this is the summary that we always put up and for you to use as a reference so that you understand that these are the key regulations that will apply to research. Okay, I'm just going to flip to these really quickly. because you should be familiar with them already. And I always make sure that we do this again so it refreshes your memory. Okay. And if you have questions on any of these, please let us know. Okay. That's it for me. Turning it back over to Sandra.
Okay, we're going to be switching gears to data governance. So the data governance program's primary goal is to protect the privacy and security of protected data, which we define as data that's not considered public and therefore has privacy considerations. We also look at data quality, promoting efficiencies, and increasing transparency and accountability to our internal and external stakeholders. So data governance, we make a distinction between institutional data, which is data used in our day-to-day business and academic operations. So we are talking primarily about student, HR, and financial types of data. And then there's data that are created, collected, and analyzed for research purposes, which is our focus today. At every webinar, I go over data classification categories. Data classification is so important because it tells you what levels of security risk your data has and what potential impact and inappropriate disclosure of that data could have. Here at UH, we have 4 data classification categories as defined in Executive Policy 2.214. We have a public category, which involves data with no restrictions around access. Student directory information and employees' business contact information are considered public data and, again, have no privacy considerations. When we refer to protected data, we're talking about the next 3 categories: restricted, sensitive, and regulated. Restricted data is used for internal purposes. We do not share with external parties unless we have a memorandum of agreement or contract with them. These are data that are not that sensitive, but it's not something that we would want to share publicly. Student contact information and UHID number are examples of restricted data. Sensitive data involves data subject to privacy considerations. Most personally identifiable information, or PII, would fall in this category. Birth date, payroll information, and most student information are sensitive. Research projects collecting highly personal responses from study participants on topics such as illegal activities, addiction, sex, housing, or food insecurity would also be classified as sensitive. The regulated category involves PII with the highest level of sensitivity. Data like first name or first initial and last name in combination with social security number, driver license number, or bank account information is regulated. Credit card information, or HIPAA, or FAFSA, which is financial aid data, also fall under the regulated category. These are data elements that, if exposed, carry some kind of repercussion to the university. Examples could include fulfilling a formal breach notification requirement to the state legislature within 20 days, or notifying FSA, Federal Student Aid, if student aid data was exposed, or the assessment of financial fines, say, for a HIPAA breach. For research projects, we mostly encounter health-related data in the regulated category, and occasionally the collection of social security numbers for individuals receiving gift cards for participation in research studies. This is another view of the types of data within each data classification categories, and the list can be found in attachment 1 of EP 2.214. The public category carries no risk and includes student directory information. These data elements have no privacy considerations under FERPA. As government employees, we have data that is deemed public as well, like our name and job information, as specified in Hawaii Revised Statutes, Chapter 92F. The restricted category with the green header is low risk. Again, these data are freely used within the university for our internal purposes without restriction, but we do not release this information without some kind of agreement with other third parties. This restricted category protects our students' contact information, in particular, from open records requests from the public. Sensitive is our default category and carries some risk. Most student information are considered sensitive. As employees, your personal information are also considered sensitive. Likewise, we classify personal information of non-UH individuals as sensitive. For surveys, collecting responses on highly personal topics again are sensitive. And if you come across a data element that you're not quite sure where it fits, for example, it might straddle the line between restricted and sensitive, then we ask that you take a conservative approach and treat it as sensitive. Please also feel free to contact us for questions. And then finally, the data elements in the regulated category are considered high risk because they are tied to external compliance requirements. And if there is an exposure of that data, as I mentioned earlier, it may have a significant negative impact on the university. As a side note, generally, the data we're concerned with are personally identifiable. But every so often, we come across non-people data that could be potentially harmful if it lands in the wrong hands. For example, organizational charts have become more sensitive in nature because they provide a wealth of information that cyber criminals can leverage, such as the phishing emails that Jody and Tony talked about. Another example may be building plans detailing power sources or security layouts. Those may not be something you want to share publicly. So although our data classification categories primarily focus on PII, they can occasionally extend to non-people data as well. When working with your data, keep in mind the following considerations. Get to know what type of data you're responsible for, including the data classification categories they fall under. More often than not, your records will contain data elements from more than one data classification categories. So protect your records according to the data element with the highest level of sensitivity. Also, consider all of the data involved in your project. For example, you might have multiple components within your project. You are, for example, hiring a third-party consultant to conduct an assessment for your grant reporting. And this requires de-identified data from one of our data systems. The consultant is helping administer surveys plus conduct interviews, which may involve identified data. All of these different aspects should be considered when determining risk and what you need to do to protect your project's data. Another point to consider is that your data may change throughout your project's life cycle. You may be collecting personally identifiable information, which is sensitive, but after you strip the identifiers, your de-identified data set becomes low risk. Later on, if you add back the identifiers, that increases the sensitivity of your data set again. So remember to look at your data holistically, not just at one point in time, because your security requirements may not stay the same, and you may need to adjust how you secure your data throughout the project. We have a data governance process, or DGP, that your research projects may be subject to depending on what data is involved. A DGP is required for projects that involve protected data. The primary purpose of the DGP is to assess and reduce the risk of data under UH's stewardship from being exposed or accessed inappropriately, and to reduce the risk of legal and financial harm. Part of that means ensuring that the project data is secured properly, that access controls are in place, and that third-party agreements contain language to protect the university. The DGP also helps us inventory what data is coming and going, and to better understand how our community uses data and where the bigger risks lay. The process also helps with information sharing within and among campuses and provides a heads up to data and IT providers who may need to be involved with the project. My office doesn't have the capacity to review every project with protected data, so we've narrowed down the research criteria to 4 types of data. The first is health data, which can be either identified or de-identified. So a study on colon cancer or telehealth services would apply. So would the transfer of de-identified data sets to partner institutions. The second situation is if you're collecting Social Security numbers, even if you're collecting only the last 4 digits of the SSN. Also applied, it also this applies if you're collecting full birth date, so month, day, and year. If you can use age or month and year or month and day instead of full birth date, it would make your data set less sensitive and would not require a DGP. The third type of data requiring a DGP is student data originally collected or issued by UH for institutional purposes. This data was originally collected for education purposes and can be data elements like student contact information, so email, home address, phone numbers, or also course type of information like GPA or course numbers. So for example, if you're using an email list to solicit participation, or even the UH announce feature, a DGP would apply. And the last type of data is personally identifiable information that are collected as part of conducting surveys, interviews, focus groups, or observations on highly sensitive topics, such as those I mentioned before: illegal activities, addiction, sexual behavior and orientation, housing, and food insecurity, and so forth. Number 3 and number 4 on this chart often go hand in hand when working with students as study participants. All of these are considered higher risk data with the exception of number 3, student data, but a DGP is required for number 3 because it involves the repurposing of data that was originally collected for student education purposes. This graphic is available at the link in red and on the data governance website. If any of your data falls within those 4 categories, you will need to submit a DGP, which is a QualiBuild form. And other documentation you may need to attach to the form include any unsigned agreements, whether it's a memorandum of agreement or understanding, data use / data sharing / data transfer agreement, vendor contract, or online terms and conditions. Those should be attached. An IRB approval letter, if applicable, should also be attached, and any other supporting materials that will help us understand your project. If we have all of the information we need, and that's a big if, then the DGP approval process can be done within a week. Oftentimes, though, it takes longer because there's a lot of back and forth between our office and the requester. So if you are a requester, please provide as much detail about what data is involved, who has access, how is it being stored, how it moves from point A to point B to point C, what will happen to the data when the project is over. Those kinds of details will help us tremendously and cut down on the back and forth. Remember, we don't know your project, so we are often starting from zero and trying to understand the entire life cycle of your data from creation or intaking a data set by a program to the end of the grant and then beyond. If you have questions or you're not sure to fill out the form because we know it is confusing, our office offers open hours in the form of 20-minute Zoom sessions where we will answer your questions and can walk through the form with you together. So please take advantage of this resource. A common delay we run into with the DGPs is when draft agreements have indemnification or governing law language in it. If you see them in your agreement when you're reviewing it, if you can address this issue upfront with the other organization, the DGP processing time will be much faster. The usual verbiage for indemnification is that UH agrees to indemnify, defend, or hold the other party harmless. This means that UH will defend the vendor or other institution, including paying for their attorney costs and pay for any monetary judgment. However, according to state statute, we are not allowed to indemnify third parties, except for 4 exceptions, but those rarely apply and require board or governor approval. So if you see indemnification language in a proposed agreement, ask the vendor to remove the language or to accept alternate language, which can be found in attachment 12 of EP 8.200, our contracts policy. If you can take care of this in advance of the DGP submission, it will reduce our processing time greatly. Likewise, check if there's language on governing law. the language will usually say governed by or subject to the jurisdiction of another state or country. Our attorneys from OGC strongly recommend not accepting another state or country's governing law, because it means that if there's a dispute, we would be subject to the other party's country's laws or state's laws. And because we're less familiar with that state or country's laws, there's a possibility UH may need to hire outside counsel. So please check if the vendor is willing to change governing law to Hawaii, or if they're willing to delete the reference completely. It's not a deal breaker like indemnification, but there may be potential financial implications with non-Hawaii governing law in your agreement. After the DGP process is complete, the requester will receive an email from QualiBuild indicating the DGP has been approved. A lot of people are not clear on what that exactly means. So in simplest terms, the DGP approval is approving the use of protected data for a specific purpose, such as your research activity. Data security based on data classifications involved in the project were looked at, and the agreement terms and conditions were reviewed and modified as needed, and the overall risk to the PI and to the university was deemed acceptable. On the requester's part, it's important to know your data and to manage it according to whatever is specified in the agreement. We've received DGPs involving health data where people don't always seem to know whether HIPAA applies or not, which is really concerning. So if you're a PI and your assistant is filling out the form on your behalf, please help them fill out the form as accurately as possible. The inconsistencies in the answers to questions in the DGP cause a lot of confusion and delays as a result. And my office should not be the one trying to figure out if HIPAA applies. Another clarification I'd like to make is about routing. After the PI is notified of the DGP approval, it's the PI's responsibility to route the unsigned agreement for signature. Unfortunately, the DGP process is not a one-stop shop, and we're not equipped to shepherd the agreements to each signator. Again, the DGP is focused on the transfer of data from one point to another, who's accessing the data, how it's being stored and used, and for how long, and trying to protect you as the PI and the university as a whole. To assist the PIs with the routing of agreements for signature, with OGC's help, we've been trying to standardize who signs what and in what order, depending on the types of agreements. So this is what we have developed so far. For HIPAA agreements for the UH system, the PI would sign first, followed by any applicable provost or chancellor, then Garrett in his role filling in as the UH HIPAA officer. For HIPAA agreements for a campus, the PI would sign, then Garrett as the VP for IT, then the provost or chancellor of the campus. For data use or data sharing or data transfer agreements that are no cost, the PI would sign, then the dean or director, then Garrett. For procurement-related agreements, we have various vendor management processes in place, so check with your FAA for guidance, or you can also check with us, my office. This is a work in progress, and we'll continue to try and clarify the routing pieces to help all of you as going forward. And finally, I'd like to end this section with the following broad data governance principles and guidelines that can help reduce the risk of inadvertent exposure and data breaches. First off, access to protected data should be on a need-to-know basis. The most restrictive set of permissions and access privileges should be granted to get a job done. When the project or activity is over and the person leaves, that access should be removed. Use de-identified data whenever you can. Do not use data beyond its intended purpose. And get permission if you plan to reuse or redisclose data. As I mentioned earlier, often records will contain data elements from different data classification categories. Make sure you protect your data according to the data element with the highest level of sensitivity. Be aware that sometimes a data element by itself may not be personally identifiable, but when combined with other data, it may be possible to reconstruct an individual's identity. If you do tabular reports, small cell sizes could potentially reveal a person's identity as well, especially if you're dealing with onesies and twosies. So you may need to adjust the way you present your numbers. Do not keep extra data sets lying around. And similarly, when data is no longer administratively needed, de-identify or get rid of it. Oh, and I think that's the end of our section. I will be turning this the screen over to Victoria.
Hello, everybody. My name is Victoria Rivera. I work in the Office of Research Compliance, and that is under the Vice President for Research and Innovation. And so I'm talking today about a couple of things, the federal focus on research security and what's happening now, as Jody had mentioned. And then we're going to go into both internal and external disclosure requirements that you as researchers at the university need to follow. So just as mentioned before by both Tony and with the FBI and Jody, there continues to be a strong focus by the federal government on research security, especially in the world of academia, with respect to protecting the intellectual property of the university. So this is just a quote from the feds, and you know, of course, you're going to hear a lot about certain countries like China and Russia. And so what are the kinds of things that we need to worry about in terms of disclosure requirements? So the things that are being criminally prosecuted and, you know, universities are paying a hefty price for is failure on the part of our researchers to fully disclose any relationships that they have with entities outside of the university. And also things like sharing US federally funded grant proposals and intellectual property and research data with foreign entities. There could be instances of kind of duplicate double funding. You get funding from a US federally sponsored agency like NIH or NSF, and then there is a unknown to the US government, a shadow grant from another foreign entity that provides even more funding for the same project. And so these are the kinds of things that we see and we worry about and we want you to understand. And so the focus on this goes back to the Trump administration. Jody mentioned National Security Presidential Memorandum 33, NSPM 33, which has carried over from the Trump administration to the current Biden administration, which in 2022 released further guidance to federal agencies about developing models for grant application forms that ensure consistency across all the different federal agencies in terms of what kinds of things our researchers need to disclose when they're applying for grant funding. And so, like Jody mentioned, these are the 5 areas in NSPM 33. What I want to focus on very briefly is number 1, disclosure requirements and standardization of those processes. And so what you see here in this table, it's hard for you to read, but you can follow the links to this presentation after we post it online. But this is basically a table of all the different kinds of things that need to be disclosed when you're applying for grant money and where to disclose those things in grant applications. And so what the feds through NSPM 33 want the various sponsoring agencies to do is to be consistent across all the different agencies in what information we need to disclose and where. And so that's what this table is about. And like Jody mentioned, the NSF is taking the lead on trying to standardize the disclosure requirements. And so a few highlights from this standardization project is that one of the things that I thought was interesting and somewhat concerning is that they may broaden the disclosure requirements to include reporting by students, in addition to what we're doing now, which is, of course, faculty and staff members involved in the design and conduct of research. We're beginning to see from various federal agencies that there are more comprehensive disclosure requirements. And it's important to note that, let's say you sign some kind of talent program contract with a foreign entity, if there's a non-disclosure clause that says you can't disclose this contract to anyone, that does not negate the requirement to report that to our sponsors through UH and through our federal sponsors. And so I just want to point out again that NSF is really the ones taking the lead on this. You'll see in their latest iteration of their policies and procedure guide from this year that they have released what they call a harmonized disclosure format. And right now they're taking feedback on that. And eventually those will be, all of those harmonized disclosures will be implemented by the other various federal funding sources. And so a few of the things that right now we think we won't have to report on are things like honoraria, support that has ended, gifts, but notate, just a quick note on gifts, although we may not need to report them through this process, we do have reporting obligations for gifts under Section 117 of the Higher Education Act. And in terms of state reporting requirements, there are, every one of us as state employees are subject to the standards of conduct under Hawaii Revised Statutes, Chapter 84. So that's outside of this process. There are other certain consulting activities that they need to work out. You know, it's inconsistent right now what we have to report in terms of consulting. So you can come to our office if there is confusion about that. And then, of course, salary and startup from the applicant university. So if you're getting startup money from UH and you're applying for federal funding through UH, that would not need to be disclosed. So there's going to be, and there already is, there have been and will continue to be serious consequences for failure for you to report to us and then us to report to the feds, any kind of external conflicts of interest. And so that can range from anything from pulling our UH funding to criminal charges against an individual. So it will affect not only you as an individual. If you fail to report, it will also affect the university's funding. That's again, I skipped ahead a little bit, but these are the kinds of serious consequences for failure to disclose. And you know, this is happening at universities all across the country. They're being fined. We're getting grants terminated at various universities, and you know, the likelihood of that happening here is just as likely. And so one of the other requirements under NSPM 33, as Jody previously mentioned, is eventually we'll have to have a research security program in place addressing these 4 elements. I know that there was a question earlier specific to foreign travel security. And just so you're aware, part of the Office of Research Compliance, we have the Export Control Office, and we do want to start beefing up our knowledge of when UH individuals are doing foreign travel. The only travel we know about right now would be travel paid through the university. But we do want to serve as a resource to you through our Export Controls Office. If you do have any concerns or questions about traveling to a certain country, our Export Control Office can do a risk assessment, threat assessment with you, and you know, address information that comes from the Department of State and my federal colleagues about specific countries and what you can do to protect yourself and your research. I highly encourage you not to take your research data with you. If you need to take a laptop, I would also encourage you to take an empty laptop without any of research data or personal data, because you know, some governments can actually seize your laptop. So I would be very cautious about taking any data with you to a foreign country. Again, on this slide, our office does include the Export Controls Office, and if you would like us to do training for your specific school or unit or department, we'd be happy to do so. Just because of all of this increased focus by the federal government on proper disclosures, we will be mandating extramural disclosure training. It will be information much like this, but more specific. And that will we will start mandating that beginning July 1st. We want to give you some time to know that that training is required. You can take the course now. There'll be a link on this. There's a link here for you to follow to take the course, but it will be required effective July 1 for all PIs and co-PIs, co-investigators and other senior key personnel that are listed on UH extramural requests for funding. And so that will be something that will be checked through my grant when you submit a proposal. So I'm going to briefly talk in the interest of time. I think we have about 6 minutes left. basically, there are disclosures that you have to make both internally to the university as well as externally to sponsors. The biggest one of which is conflict of interest disclosure. Here are UH policies on conflict of interest that you can refer to. And basically a conflict of interest is a situation in which your external involvement in other entities, your financial, professional, or other personal interests may either appear to or actually influence your judgment in fulfilling your responsibilities to the university. So this covers whenever you answer questions about potential conflicts of interest, we're talking about both you as an employee, as well as your family members, spouse, dependent children. And we're talking UH employees as well as RCUH employees. And just here's a list of specifically, according to our current policy, who has to complete the disclosure: faculty, administrators, key personnel involved in grant applications, as well as those who have authority to act on behalf of UH in the procurement process. And so right now, I know it's a little confusing, but we currently have two different forms. So one is specifically related to extramural funding, and that's we call it RCOI, R being for research. And so this one is connected to the MyGrant proposal system. And so we can verify at grant proposal and award stage whether you've submitted your disclosure form. We can look at the awards connected to you and do a lot of checks and inquiries with you on that. If you are not involved in extramural research, then if you're an employee that isn't involved in grant funding, then you would fill out the Quality Build disclosure form. And so there's a rolling deadline. You have to do it every 12 months for the RCOI disclosure, versus we really push every year on the non-research side, an annual deadline of April 15th. However, with both of these deadlines, if there are any changes to your financial or involvement in external entities, you need to submit a modified, a revised disclosure within 30 days of any change. So I'm not going to go into great detail here. I'd ask you to please refer to the presentation and to our website for our definition of a significant financial interest. It is summarized here, but what I do want you to think about very carefully is not just entities that are within the US, but as the feds are focused on foreign involvement, you also have to report foreign entities, organizations, and government agencies. And so here are a few examples. I don't have time, I don't think, to read through all these, but you can see them. They're examples of the kinds of things you should disclose. And the next slide gives you a few examples of the items that you don't have to disclose, such as mutual funds that you have no direct control over those investments. So as a parting as a parting message, if you aren't sure whether you should report it, if you're in doubt, please just report it. If you would like to ask our office whether we think it's a potential conflict of interest, of course, we'd be more than happy to help you with that. I think that for now, we can refer to the rest of this information from the slides that we're going to make available online, so we can turn it over to questions at this time.
I think we have about a minute left. If anybody has questions, even after this webinar, here's our contact information. And also, if you have questions for Tony, we can also forward that on to him. Thank you very much. This concludes our webinar this morning, and we would like to thank Tony again for joining us. And we will make the recordings and slide deck available on the Office of Research Compliance website. And then as you exit this webinar, you will be asked to complete a short survey. We really appreciate your feedback. We do go through it and read through it. So thank you very much for joining us. We hope this was helpful in raising awareness on how to protect our research data, which is very important to the university. So thank you very much for being here.